I'm Tristan Howell. On my right is Genny Molling, and I'm here is Leonette Eikens. For my first question, we'll start with Leonette. Where did you grow up and how large was your family?
I grew up near New Albin, and I had 2 sisters, no brothers.
Your sisters?
I grew up in the Winnebago Valley.
Winnebago Valley, okay.
I grew up in South Dakota, and I had 1 brother and 2 sisters.
What was your typical day like as a child?
That's pretty hard to answer. I don't remember too much about it. Well, by the school age, when I first lived in South Dakota, when we first moved there, I spoke German, and the neighbor boy used to poke fun at me because I was speaking a foreign language. So I soon learned English. And then, of course, when I went to school, I continued to speak English because I didn't want the kids poking fun at me.
My school days, when I was in the grade school, we were always happy to see the Winnebago Creek flood because that meant no school for us because we lived on the other side of the creek. And living on the farm, we had chores. I helped milk cows and take care of chickens and so forth.
Was that like what did you do during the summer when you were?
Well,
like
my son,
chores?
I had no brothers, and being the oldest girl, I was #1 helper for my dad, and I cultivated corn and the likes of that, helped with haying, so on. And I liked that better than staying in the house and cooking.
Yeah.
We lived right on the edge of town, and my dad worked uptown, so I didn't live on a farm as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so during the summers, quite a few of us in the neighborhood would go down and play on the school playground when we were smaller, and then we pretty much spent the time doing normal activities as far as playing ball or going biking and things like that.
I think living on a farm, growing up on the farm, I didn't get together with other people of my age as much as you do, I'm sure. I didn't go as far then either. I did my traveling after I've grown up, and we would take occasional trips here or there, but not too far. I just think it was a quieter life, more time for the reading.
Yeah.
My dad liked to fish, and he often took us fishing.
Yeah,
We'd take a picnic lunch along
Uh-huh.
and fish for the afternoon or whatever.
So, why did you decide to become a teacher?
I liked school very much, and I always thought that it would be very interesting. At first, when I first graduated, or before I graduated from high school, I thought I wanted to be a nurse. But teaching appealed a little bit more, and at that time, it required less schooling. You didn't need a 4-year degree or anything like that, and it was more economical. So I went into teaching, and I've never regretted it since.
What about you?
Well, I think it was partly because my grandmother had been a teacher, and she thought that would be a good profession for me to go into. And I like reading, I like doing schoolwork and so on, and I guess she thought it might fit me.
Yeah, my mother had been a teacher, and it was always her hope of the 3 of us girls that at least one of us would become a teacher, so I ended up being what she wanted.
So what kind of education did you need to be a teacher?
In South Dakota, to teach in a country school at that time is where I started. You only needed a 1-year teaching certificate. And then after I taught 1 year, then I continued to go back to school during the summers and earned my 2-year certificate, which allowed me to teach in city school. But when I came to Minnesota, Minnesota's requirements required a 4-year degree, so then I further went back to school more until I got it.
I started out with a 2-year teaching certificate from Winona State and got my 4-year degree. after I went back to teaching.
Now, what grades did you teach and where?
When I started in the country, I had all 8 grades. Maybe 1 or 2 in a grade. I think I only had 14 students the first year I taught. And I had 2 first graders and a second grader and 1 third grader, a 4th grader, a 5th grader, 4 7th graders, and 2 8th graders. So it was quite a wide range of preparation for teaching. And of course, in a rural school, you had to fix your own fires, get your own water in from the pump outside. And I also stayed in what they called a teacherage. It was a portion of the school that was attached, and just during the week I would stay there and would go home on the weekends. And my first country school was 18 miles from town.
What about you?
I started teaching in a country school too, and then came to teach in Caledonia. And I taught mainly 4th grade before I was married. And then afterwards, I went into the Title I program when I went back to teaching when my youngest child was starting kindergarten.
When I was teaching in the rural schools, of course, you got up and you fixed a fire and you made your own breakfast, and you prepared, well, you'd had your lessons prepared, what you were going to present for the children the evening before. Of course, the favorite part of the kids' days was recess too, and they played ball and all such things like that. Different games that I don't think the kids play anymore, that's for sure. But it was a very interesting day as far as materials that you taught. Sometimes you could combine a class with another grade, I mean, like say 4th and 5th, and if they were studying similar materials, you might cover the same material or do it one year and then reverse the material so that you could teach the opposite, or what you hadn't taught in the grade before, the next year, knowing that you'd always have those same students and so on. But with only one in many of the grades at a time, it was a challenge to get that many classes in. Your classes certainly weren't very long.
And when I started to teach in town, I thought, oh my, all this time that I can spend on this subject, it was such a change that way. And it was a very welcome change that you had more time to work with the children and to discuss something a little bit more fully and so on. And my country school teaching was like hers a little bit there too. But in town, I think we didn't have to fix the fire, we didn't have to clean the rooms afterwards and so on.
Very
and
true.
So you had more time for preparation and checking papers and so forth, planning things.
Yeah, when I first came to Caledonia, that was 1947, I believe. I taught in 8th grade, and I had taught previously in South Dakota 2 years in town schools also. So I was familiar with the town school teaching, but I had 32 students, I believe, the first year that I taught in Caledonia. And that was quite an increase in number, but it was much easier to teach that many to one grade rather than having so many grade levels.
Did you have the students help you out in that country school, like build the fires and?
Not the fires. They didn't fix the fire.
No.
You had to have that done beforehand.
Yeah, I had students that came to school on horseback when they'd ride 4 miles on horseback. And one family had 3 little boys, a 1st and a 3rd and a 5th grader, and they all rode the same horse.
Did you ever have snow days?
Yes, in the country schools you did, or we did. South Dakota is known for a great many blizzards. And I only had one family that lived approximately 3/4 of a mile from the school. So this mother would call and find out if the other students were coming, because most of them lived anywhere from 2 to 4 miles. And if we had a lot of snow and so on, why sometimes the parents would call and say they weren't sending their children. And if all of them, in that I only had one family that lived close enough, she would often say, well, I won't send my children then either. So we had forced snow days, but it wasn't, we made them up. I mean, we had to make up the work, but not on particular, I don't think I ever remember making up any days at the end of the year particularly.
So you always ended on the time you predicted?
Usually. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't recall any snow days
Oh.
in the country, but I do remember that we had to extend school another week because I got the chicken pox 2 weeks before school was out. And we had to
Oh.
close the school for a week.
So what was your worst subject, to
For
teach?
teaching?
Yeah.
Well, while she's thinking, I'll tell you, for me, it was music. I traded with another teacher, so she would teach my music. You see, that when I first started teaching the Caledonia school, there was not a music teacher in the lower grades. You had to teach your own music. But I persuaded the 5th grade teacher to take mine, and I taught her science.
Well, the last year I taught in the rural schools, I had all boys. And the boys in the upper grades, their voices were changing, and they detested having to sing. So I asked the superintendent if I could teach a shop class instead. I taught them the basics of music, that you would normally teach, note reading and things like that. But we didn't do much singing that particular year. But we did, the one boy made a card table and won first place at, they had a county, what would
Like
you
a
call
fair?
it? Yeah, like at the fair, but not, it was a county school activity.
Mhm.
And he won a first place on his card table, and they made other projects. They might have made birdhouses and things like that, but it was a kind of a shop class instead. I learned more probably from them than they learned from me in the shop part of it. But as far as music, you had your little programs and things where you taught all of the kids songs and things like that.
Now, what was your funniest experience in the classroom?
Well, I think it was fun when you had programs at school to prepare the kids with little poems or songs and things that they would present a little program to their parents. And usually it ended up with some kind of treats that were given. And we always had a school picnic at the end of the year. So, and then they played games. The superintendent visited the school to evaluate your teaching at least once a year, is about it. But one school that I remember, the last year that I taught, I think although that was closer to where I lived, she did come twice a year, but otherwise it was usually just once a year.
I always enjoyed the Christmas programs too, because in the country school that was kind of a big thing. In the first year, I think we did not have electric lights in that, so we had kerosene lamps up high, and the school was not a one-room school exactly. It actually had a room that was a library, and so that's where the kids were in between acts,
Nice.
And then we had fixed curtains across and so on. And we had it at night, whereas in other school, they have programs in the afternoon.
Yeah, usually I had them in the afternoon.
What is your proudest memory of teaching?
To see the expression on a child's face when something that they didn't understand all of a sudden dawns on them, and there's just like a complete change in their Oh, I know what she's talking about. And I think that's one of the happiest things that a teacher can experience.
Would you agree with that?